Rachel, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Hey, I'm really looking forward to working with you on these going forward.
Me too. I'm super excited for this segment and then the actual Dan Schnur political report when we get into the audience questions. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, the webinars are a lot of fun, but what I like about these is it gives us a chance to answer more of the audience questions than we had a chance to during the webinar itself. So, what have you got from our audience for this session?
Yeah. So as we're getting started today, as you know, today, Friday, the Supreme Court made one of the most sweeping decisions in its history when six of its justices voted to overturn Roe versus Wade. There are a lot of strong emotions going around on both sides of the issue. So, what are you looking for as this debate moves forward?
Boy, I know that wasn't one of the things that we talked about in this month's webinar, but back in April, we did a full session talking about Roe versus Wade. And I'm going to really look forward to revisiting it with you when we talk with our group again on July 5th. But in the meantime, the battle over abortion rights at this point is going to move forward on three different fronts. The first is on a state by state level. And it appears that when all is said and done, that roughly half of the states in the country will either have outlawed or very strictly limited the access to an abortion for women in their state. And so what we'll see right away is a state by state division, almost 25 to 25, even split, or 24 or 26 in one direction or another, where each state is deciding how to go forward. So first, we're going to see this fight taking place at state capitals all around the country. The second fight that's going to be a very important one to watch is in the federal government. And President Biden went on television earlier today, Friday, to outline steps that his administration would be taking, both out of the Justice Department and out of the Department of Health and Human Services, to help women in those states that might be banning abortion, to give them access either through medication or through travel or other types of support, the ability to go through that process if it's something that they still choose to do. So look at this to be a much, much bigger point of debate in the next presidential election than it was in either 2020 or 2016. The third place where we're going to see this fight wage, and we talked about this a little bit in our April webinar, is in Congress. You may remember, Rachel, of course you do, and I know most of our audience members do as well, that the Democrats in Congress put up legislation earlier this spring that would have codified Roe versus Wade legislatively had it passed. Now that bill failed. And one of the reasons it failed, not the only reason, of course, is that the legislation that was introduced didn't simply restate Roe versus Wade as it currently exists in federal law. In the eyes of many members of Congress, including some pro-choice members, that legislation actually expanded abortion rights in the country. Now, there's a lot of very smart people in the country, including a lot of smart members of our audience, who would argue that abortion rights should not just be maintained, but should be expanded. But for a certain number of pro-choice members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, that expansion caused them to vote no. And one of the things that we're going to need to watch going forward is whether Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer decide to put a more restrained version of Roe versus Wade codification forward in a bill, or alternatively, if they simply decide to wait until after the election in hopes of increasing congressional majorities. Pelosi also today on Friday said that her first thought was to wait until after November so that perhaps stronger Democratic majorities could move on a more expansive bill. But I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on both Pelosi and Schumer given the idea that some protection is better than none, to at least try to pass a more measured piece of legislation between now and in the midterm elections this fall.
Thank you, Dan. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that topic on our July 5th webinar, and I'm sure that the audience will learn a ton from the discussion that we do.
Yeah, I know we'd originally talked, Rachel, about using that July 5th webinar to talk about the Congressional Special Committee hearings on January 6th, on the events of January 6th. But I think most of our audience would agree, as you and I have, that shifting the focus, giving the Roe versus Wade decision is the right one to make.
Definitely, completely agree. I think it's such a pressing topic. Now, kind of moving back to our audience questions from June's webinar. Earlier this month, we talked about the battle for the majority in Congress, and we got a ton of really great audience questions about that topic. How does the decision today on Roe versus Wade change your thinking on the November elections?
Boy, I was thinking of the exact same point, Rachel, as I was watching the news coverage begin to roll out earlier today. And even though obviously the substance of what this means is much more important than the politics, after all, we are a political webinar, so it only makes sense for us to talk about the political end of this also. So when we talked earlier this month, I'd mentioned that historically, the odds of Democrats maintaining their majorities in Congress this fall are pretty slim. And we've learned that from history. We've learned that when a president's approval rating is higher, his party generally tends to gain seats in Congress. When a president's approval rating is lower, they generally tend to do worse. And of course, President Biden's approval numbers at this point are very low, in the low 40s or high 30s, depending on which poll that you look at. And so pronounced have those historical trends been that in fact, there have only been 3 times in the last 100 years in which the president's party won seats during a midterm election rather than having lost them. There have only been 3 times when the party holding power has been able to expand its majority. As I mentioned when we talked earlier this month, the 2 most recent of those occurrences were in 2002, when President George W. Bush and the Republican congressional majority were able to utilize voter concerns in the immediate aftermath of September 11th relating to national security to help increase their margins. The other of the 2 more recent examples was in 1998, when Democratic President Bill Clinton and his Democratic majority in Congress benefited from the backlash against the Republicans that many voters felt in the aftermath of that year's impeachment to President Clinton. Before that, and I think I might have left this one out back in June, so I'm glad we're able to fix it now. Before those 2 occurrences, the only other time in the last 100 years in which a president's party has gained seats rather than lost seats in the midterm elections was in 1934. And Rachel, I'm pretty sure that that was before your time. And believe it or not, it was a little bit before my time also. But in 1934, it was only 2 years after Franklin Roosevelt was first elected president at the depths of the Great Depression. And so what we've learned, whether it's a depression, an impeachment, or a terrorist attack on New York City and Washington, D.C., it takes really extraordinary circumstances for a president's party to gain seats in midterm elections. But one of the things that we talked about back earlier this month is that one of the real challenges, one of the reasons that a president's party usually doesn't do that well, is the party in power usually has a much more difficult time motivating their base to turn out. If you're the minority party, in this case, the Republicans, your most loyal supporters are motivated because they want to get back in charge. But when you are in charge, your party's most loyal supporters tend to be a little bit less excited about a midterm election. You haven't been able to accomplish everything that you promised along the way. And so their motivation levels are much lower. And that's one of the biggest challenges that Joe Biden has been facing. He is having a very, very difficult time motivating young people, voters from minority communities, and other progressive voters who would never, ever vote for a Republican in a midterm election, but who just weren't all that excited to vote this November. And the court's decision, not just to modify or to limit Roe versus Wade, But to actually overturn it, many people feel that that could provide a motivator for Democratic base voters to turn out in November. They might not be that excited about Biden. They might not be all that thrilled with Congress's accomplishments over the course of the last 2 years. But the overturn of federal protection of abortion rights, a lot of Democratic strategists to believe, could create a motivation that might create the same type of counter dynamic that occurred in the previous elections that we were talking about. There's no guarantee. Republicans certainly still are the strong favorites for all sorts of reasons, some of which we mentioned earlier. But if there is a wild card that could allow the Democrats to maintain or even expand their majorities, the Supreme Court may have given it to them this week.
Thank you so much for that, Dan. We spent most of our time in the last webinar talking about the Los Angeles mayoral election between Karen Bass and Rick Caruso. So since we talked at the beginning of June, a lot more results from the primary have come in. So how does that change the way you're now thinking about the race?
Well, one of the things about California elections is that we certainly take our time getting them done. There have been all sorts of laws passed at the state level over the last several years that, in order to give more Californians the chance to vote, has greatly slowed the vote counting process. And now any ballot that's submitted that arrives by mail within 7 days of the election can still be counted. So here we sit now, a few weeks after the election day, and we still have votes coming in. And those late votes really have very dramatically changed the landscape going forward. Make no mistake about it, Rick Caruso and Karen Bass are still by far the two top candidates and are still certainly going on to a general election campaign. But the balance between those two in the primary has changed dramatically. On election night, it appeared that Caruso had finished first by a fairly narrow margin, and that influenced a lot of our expectations and our assumptions about the race going forward in ways that we'll talk about a little bit later. But since then, as more and more votes have been counted, first Bass moved closer to Caruso, then as more votes were counted, she moved ahead of him, and then as even more votes were counted, her lead grew even bigger. So instead of Caruso finishing first in the primary by a few percentage points, the results now show that Karen Bass finished first by 7.5 points in the primary. And I'll take just a minute to explain why that's so important. So Karen Bass got just over 43% of the vote in the primary campaign. Of course, you need 50% to be elected. Caruso got just under 36%. So what that means is if you add the two of those up, that gets you to 79% of the electorate. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we're going to assume that the two candidates split the rest of those votes evenly, 10 or 11, 10.5 for Karen Bass, 10 or 11, 10.5 for Rick Caruso. That gets Bass up to almost 54% of the vote. And to be a little bit more considered in how we forecast going forward, it's worth noting that the only other two candidates who got more than 2% of the vote in the primary, Kevin De Leon and Gina Viola, are both well to the left politically and ideologically of Bass. And so I think what you can do is you can really assume, again, being a little bit small c conservative on this, that Bass probably gets not half, but probably gets 2/3 of the votes that De Leon and Viola received. And if you reconfigure the vote distribution along those lines, that gets Karen Bass up to between 56 and 57% of the vote. And of course, you only need 50% plus one to win. Now, this race isn't over by any stretch of the imagination. Caruso has a lot of time, he has many months, and he has a great deal of money to change voters' mind. But changing the minds of 56 to 57% of the voters, or even that percentage that would require to get Bass down below 50%, that's a lot. And it's not impossible. but it's something that would be almost unprecedented in modern political history. So it's going to be really interesting going forward to find out what Caruso and his allies say about Bass that might move away some of her supporters over to him. But it's a pretty heavy lift. One other thing, Rachel, that we've learned since the election about the vote is how it was distributed. So on one hand, from a partisan basis, let me back up for just a moment there. If we look at the LA Times poll from April, we saw that Caruso was winning by 1 point. If we look at the Times poll from right before the election, we saw that they pretty much nailed it. The people at Times and the Institute of Government Studies at Berkeley almost nailed it perfectly, showing Bass with a 7-point lead. So what changed? Which voters moved in between April and the election? And a couple things happened. One, we saw the race break down on a much more predictable level on a partisan basis. Now, Caruso, of course, is not a Republican, at least not anymore, and that's something he and Bass will argue about all the way from now till November. But what we saw very clearly is large numbers of Democrats moving toward Bass where they hadn't been previously, and a lot of Republicans moving toward Caruso. Among that Democratic shift, though, it was driven almost entirely by white liberal voters. Caruso actually did much better among voters from communities of color than might have been expected. He held his own among the Latino portion of the electorate and actually gained ground among Black voters. And what we saw in those communities, in minority communities, we saw an immense gender gap opening up. Female voters, Latinas and female Black voters, voted for Bass by very, very large numbers. But male voters in both of those communities preferred Caruso equally strongly. And one of the reasons for that were the issues that the different voters prioritized. Male voters, particularly male voters from the Black and Latino community, prioritized crime and public safety as their most important issue. That drove them to Caruso. Female voters, particularly in those communities, but throughout the electorate, tended to prioritize economic issues. And with inflation going up, the question of housing affordability in particular worked to Bass's benefit. So again, we got a long way to go between now and November, but what these much more complete numbers show us is that while the race certainly isn't over, it's going to be a very, very steep uphill climb for Caruso if he is going to become the next mayor of Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Dan. Yeah, I think it'll be a really interesting race as we move forward. And I know that we'll be speaking about it more in the future. So very excited to see how the results play out in November.
Well, we will certainly talk about it over the next months, both the mayor's race and the midterm elections in Congress. But on July 5th, Rachel, I'm looking forward to talking with you about what comes after Roe versus Wade. It should be a fascinating conversation. I hope as much of our audience as possible is able to join us for it.
Me too. And we will have that available to register on the website. So our audience can go to our website at wawakth.org and register for the July 5th program. So we're looking forward to seeing you then, Dan.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Rachel. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.